Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a mini-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Series 1, Science as Inquiry. Episode 7, Characteristics of Good Critical Thinking. The fox knows many little things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. Archaic. In 1953, the philosopher and essayist Isaiah Berlin published a popular essay written for the general public of the title, The Hedgehog and the Fox. The essay was sort of a meditation on Leo Tolstoy's sort of view of history. And in it, as is seen from the title, Berlin sort of uses this idea of the quote that there are two ways in which people sort of process and understand information from the ancient Greek poet Archaic. And it's this idea that when one looks at a subject matter, one can maybe be divided into one of two categories. One is that idea of the hedgehog, that all things are filtered through one specific idea, one specific view, one specific overarching framework through which everything is viewed and to which everything is connected. Conversely, one could also be categorized as something like a fox, someone who gathers information from a number of different places and builds a framework from all of this information. And in this, Berlin, in his own words, says he never actually meant this framework very seriously. He says in his words, quote, "I never meant it very seriously. I meant it as kind of an enjoyable intellectual game, but it has been taken very seriously. Every classification throws light on something." End quote. And so it is, as we enter our second part of our series on critical thinking, I want to sort of use this as a framework to understand critical thinking, because there's been a great deal of conversation in the number of years, in the nearly or more than half a century since Berlin wrote his essay, that sort of looks at this idea of categorizing thinkers into two different frameworks or two different categorizations or classifications. And so it is that we're going to look at critical thinking in a sense through that lens. Now, as we begin here, let me just say a couple of quick words. First off, again, this is something between one of our typical scripted episodes and one of my unscripted episodes, in that I have a few notes that I've written down from a lecture that I gave one of my classes back when I taught at Gordon State College. And so this will not be as polished as one of my scripted shows, but it perhaps will be a bit more organized than one of my unscripted shows, somewhere in the middle. And so let's go ahead and jump into the material as a continuation of our episode from last time, where we just introduced what critical thinking is. Again, to summarize very quickly, if you haven't listened to that episode, there are a couple of things just that we said. First off, we said that critical thinking is one of the habits of mind that any, I would say, educated individual should develop as a way to fully understand and engage with the world in which they live. It's part of the ability to communicate ideas, to problem solve, to critically or creatively think or be innovative, and a process, of course, of continuous evaluation. We defined critical thinking, and this is just one definition, and there are so many out there, of course, as I mentioned, as a way of approaching information gathering, evaluation, and analysis that arrives at supportable conclusions. We said that it's an interrelated set of skills and processes, something that we're going to talk about in great detail today. It's something that requires practice and constant work and constant updating to get good at and to stay good at. And it's one of the things that sort of distinguishes scientists from other types of individuals. And so we sort of talked about that. And then finally we said, as I mentioned earlier, it is a process where you start out and you sort of inform and describe yourself. You do discovery and exploration. You consider, evidence and engage with the evidence in an active way. You test your ideas, your conclusions that you're drawing from that, and then you integrate and apply that. And that takes you back into the inform and describe kind of a thing. And this is a cyclical process, much like we've talked about with scientific inquiry and a process of scientific inquiry. Critical thinking in general is a process-oriented thing. It's not something that you do once. It's not linear necessarily. It's something that is dynamic and ongoing. And so that having been said, let's go ahead and talk about some guidelines. If you're thinking, okay, am I practicing good critical thinking? Let's talk about some guidelines that I've come up with that I teach my students that sort of are hallmarks of what I think of as good critical thinking. And finally, the one last caveat, I'm going to qualify everything I say here, right? You go out and you do research on this and you look at this. As I said in the first episode, you look at 10 different people's discussion of critical thinking, and I think you're going to get 10 different specific sort of definitions and discussions of this. There isn't what I would call a single particular, what I would say is, this is critical thinking and everybody agrees on it. The characteristics that our guidelines I'm going to try to give you are things that I think are consensus things that the broad majority of the community that thinks about and talks about critical thinking tries to hold, okay, or sort of agrees on as is important in critical thinking. And as we go through this, I hope you will see that there will be some very strong themes that develop in this that relate back to our discussion on the practice of doing science in our previous episodes in this series, and also that maybe relate to this quote used by Berlin. So let's go ahead and get into this. The first guideline that I always talk about with my students is, and again, this is because I tend to view critical thinking through an inquiry-based lens. That's the kind of the paradigm that I view critical thinking through. And that is that I think critical thinking always should have an inquiry focus, okay? In other words, good critical thinkers are curious, they're asking questions, good questions, and they're seeking the answers to those questions in an organized fashion. And so there are a couple of things that sort of go with that. First off, understand that's the focus, is to ask questions and then find answers. Okay, and so there is this desire in a good critical thinker not to prove something, but in a sense to discover something. Okay, that I think is profoundly important. There's a real reorientation in that critical thinking process. If you're just using critical thinking to try to prove your point, well, that means that you're not really critically thinking. What you're doing is you're just trying to go out and gather evidence for an already arrived at conclusion. You've got the cart before the horse. You have a conclusion that you already believe is true, and now you're just trying to get evidence to support your conclusion. Good critical thinkers have it the other way around. Instead of, we used the example last time of perhaps capital punishment. If you've already decided that capital punishment is bad, or that capital punishment is appropriate and good, and now you're just going to go out and find evidence to support that, it means you're going to neglect all the evidence that doesn't. Okay, a good critical thinker says, okay, wait a minute, we have this thing, it's called capital punishment. There's this discussion about it, maybe an argument, it's a big political thing. Should we have a death penalty, in our state or in our country? Okay, so what's the evidence that supports having that? What's the evidence against having that? What are the claims made by either side? Let's go in and take a look at those things, okay? Let's discover what the positions are. Let's discover what the evidence is, and then use that to arrive at a conclusion, not the other way around. And then the second thing is, and this is something we've already talked about in a previous thing, is once you've done that, now you sit down and you say, okay, can I test these ideas? There's this sense of, okay, once you arrive at, a preliminary conclusion, you don't just say, okay, I've gone out and looked at this, I've come up with my ideas. It's like, no, wait a minute. Am I open to testing these ideas? Are there ways in which I can take a look at that, and sort of see what's going on? Maybe you've done a bunch of research on what might be thought of as gun rights or gun control or all of that. Now, if you're a policymaker, are you willing to go out and try to test some of those ideas? So that's the first thing. There's this inquiry focus, and I can't tell you how important I think that is in the critical thinking process. In a way, the idea of trying to discover instead of trying to prove, that's the key thing in good critical thinking. All right. Second thing I want to talk about with critical thinking is what I call flexibility. Okay. Flexibility is, I think good critical thinkers are flexible. They allow ambiguity and uncertainty as part of that process. Okay. One of the things that's really interesting is I can remember back in the in the days when we in the United States as a country were having a lot of debates about the how we dealt with the habit of cigarette smoking, okay, and smoking in public places, and whether we should be taxing tobacco products, and whether that tax should be used to pay for the societal health care costs associated with cigarette smoking and those kinds of things. And the thing that was really interesting about that in early on was, before all of the evidence really came to light about how much we knew about how bad cigarette smoking wasn't just for the individual doing the smoking, but for all of the individuals around that person, was as evidence was coming out, the evidence, especially early on, wasn't always completely crystal clear. It wasn't like there was just a simple study and, smoking in public places and secondhand smoke is really bad for everybody. It's that the evidence came out and there was some ambiguity in this. Okay, there might be 3 studies that said it was bad and 1 study that said, well, maybe it's not so bad. Okay, one of the things that's really interesting for me right now is I'm actually doing some follow-up research. I do, my research that I do is in physics education and how students learn physics. And so I went out the other night and spent some time doing sort of a literature search on that. And one of the things that's really interesting is there was a study published by Richard Hake back in 1998, and then he published a follow-on study in 2002 that talked about how certain teaching methods produced better conceptual learning among students in introductory physics classes, and he had a significant amount of data to support that claim. And that study got cited an awful lot. Well, in the mid to late 2000s, some other sort of papers came out that began to call Hake's his conclusions into question. Now, the thing is if I were really dogmatic about this, I would say, well, no, the Hake paper's right and these other guys have got to have it wrong, and that's the whole thing. Instead, if I'm a good critical thinker, what I sit down and I do is I look at those papers and I go, okay, Hake's got his data, these guys have got some data, I wonder what's going on. Well, it turns out in 2014, another paper with about 10 times more data than the Hake paper, as well as some other data, went back and looked at this. And this paper, with much larger data numbers, absolutely confirmed the Hake paper. But not only did it do that, and this is what was important to me, that's just a bigger study, and okay, you put that in the pile of things that support that certain types of teaching pedagogies and methodologies are more effective than others. But what these authors also did is they addressed some of the concerns or some of the results found in other papers and said, hey, here's why we think those guys came up with those results, and we moved forward. In other words, in that period of time, you allow, as a good critical thinker, there's some ambiguity in here. Maybe not every study comes up with the same thing. And you ask, okay, why are these guys disagreeing? You don't just say, okay, those guys are bad and this guy's good. You say, okay, why is there a disagreement? Why doesn't the data agree? Why is there some ambiguity here? Now, maybe, as you apply this, as I apply this as a physics teacher, I have to make a decision about how I'm going to teach my class. But the thing that's interesting is I try to be open-minded and adaptable about that. If it turns out, what I'm right in the process now of reading a paper about specifically teaching how to teach, or specifically talks about how to teach electric circuits and electric circuit concepts. And it turns out that the authors of this paper have come up and said, hey, wait, there's some really important context pieces in this. And, it's not just a one-size-fits-all necessarily, because if you're teaching with physical circuits, you may get different results than if you're teaching with simulated circuits, for example, or something like that. As I develop my teaching, the curriculum that I teach with, the way I teach, what we call sort of the pedagogy that goes along with that, if I'm good, I'm open-minded as these new results come in. And I may say, okay, wait a minute, you know what? As new data comes in, I need to adapt what I'm doing. I need to change how I'm teaching. I need to take evidence in as maybe I do pre-test and post-test to see what my students' learning gains are and find out, oh my gosh, there's not as good in this area as I want them to be. Maybe I need to go back and do some look, or maybe I make a change and think, okay, this change is going to be great. And then as I get my data, I come back and I say, oh my gosh, my students didn't do as well. Now, is that real? Is that because the curriculum's not good? Or is that because I've got small sample sizes? Because I don't teach classes of 300 students, I teach classes of 20. And so maybe it takes a few semesters for me to gather that data. Regardless, the idea here is you want to take sort of, notice in teaching physics, I could just say, I'm a physicist, and so we're going to talk about this physics. No, instead, I look at this from a physics perspective. I look at this from an educational perspective. There may be some psychology stuff that goes on. One of the things that we're talking about right now is because every generation of students that you teach is different, because every generation has a different set of societal and social, in a sense, generational experiences and life experiences. I got to modify my teaching, right? And notice I'm taking information in from many different disciplines. Good critical thinkers are multidisciplinary in taking in their information. They're open-minded and adaptable, right? Which is, by the way, one of the hardest things, at least for me. Once I get something that I feel like works, it's really hard for me to continue to take in information and compare it and come in that space where there's some ambiguity, especially if that new information doesn't fit into what I already feel is a working paradigm, right? Then the other thing is you avoid dichotomies. Okay, it's one of the things, whether you listen to Dan Carlin's latest Common Sense podcast or any number of other things, as a good critical thinker, you can't go into what I call black and white thinking, good and evil, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, right? I mean, whatever the case, for me, traditional lecture lab pedagogy versus studio physics pedagogy, which is what I tend to use. I can't just sit down and say, that's all bad and this is all good, right? And sometimes you'll hear people talk about passive learning versus active learning, and then they make these statements that are very dichotomy based. And one of the things that I always try to do when I give seminars on good teaching is I always try to break that down and say, it's the thing that you'll oftentimes hear is people say, well, lecture is passive learning and that's always bad. And these things are active learning and that's always good. And I just show a couple of examples where I say, look, here's something that people call active learning. It's not. It's actually passive learning, and it's not effective, right? It's not whether it's good or bad. It's whether it's effective or not effective. And here are some cases where things that people might call passive learning, lecture style things, that turn into actually they produce learning gains, which is effective teaching, right? So the idea is you've got to avoid those kinds of dichotomies. And then the other thing is you sort of, a good critical thinker, and for me this is the hardest thing because I don't like it. It's uncomfortable for me, but a good critical thinker relishes complexity and unsolved issues. Now I'll say for me, I love complexity. I love getting in there and seeing all the complexity and seeing how the relationships put together. I dig that. That's part of who I am as a systems thinker, as a design thinker. What I hate is the fact that I can't necessarily resolve all of that complexity into a picture necessarily. That's the thing I get uncomfortable with. Okay. The other thing is that you also try to think divergently. That's part of this flexibility. It's not just, okay, I'm going to try to go to a specific endpoint. It's the, okay, wait a minute, let's take a step back. What about some other ideas? Is it maybe, maybe there's a whole completely different way I could teach physics that I haven't thought about. Let's try to sort of, what other ways could I do this? You sort of go out and you look and you spend explicit time and effort trying to think about or get information about alternative ideas that you haven't yet sort of looked at, or alternative explanations that you haven't looked at. One of the things, recently as I'm teaching my classes here, I began to realize that I have a really different, I have the first students that are coming out of the post 9/11 event. And, most generational studies folks say that's a watershed event. Okay, that and some other things have created a new generation. And so I did some thinking and did some reading and some research, and I thought, okay, I think I've got kind of a framework of how to sort of understand this generation and how that's going to affect my teaching. But one of the things that I did is I know that the provost at my institution is really connected in on the national conversation on this level. So I set up a meeting and I sat down and said, hey, here are my ideas. I want you to put more information in my head, more divergent points of view into my head. And he gave me a lot of other stuff to think about. And so as I'm sort of looking at these frameworks, that's one of the big things that I'm trying to do, is instead of sitting down and say, well, I sat down and I figured this out and it must be right because, is to sit down and say, no, wait a minute. I may not have this. Let's not rush to judgment, to use that old phrase from the OJ trials. Instead, let's go ahead and continue to gather information. That's something good critical thinkers can do. All right. Guideline number 3, what I call an awareness of bias. This is a really important thing, I think, as we get into critical thinking, is a good critical thinker is aware that there's always what we will call bias. There's always a point of view when we're talking about ideas. People form ideas based on, a whole variety of things. We've talked about in some other episodes of the podcast some of how, whether it was, Roger Bacon or Francis Bacon or a number of other individuals, how they talk about the presence of bias. Okay. And so the good critical thinker, what you do is you really work to identify inherent biases and assumptions. Okay. That's a huge step in good critical thinking. And this, by the way, most importantly, applies first to yourself. You look at yourself and you say, what are my biases and what are my assumptions? Okay. One of the things that I had to do to become a better physics teacher is I had to let go of the assumption that we all tend to generally have, which is all my students are like me. My experiences going through my physics education, that those in some sense were either normative or were shared by everybody else going through a physics curriculum. And, the author that really helped me understand that was a woman by the name of Sheila Tobias. And Sheila Tobias did this great job of sort of suggesting that then the number of individuals who start on the physics curriculum already are a small percentage, and the number of individuals who finish a physics curriculum is less than 5%. And the problem, of course, is that when you want to talk to people about, okay, what's good for a physics curriculum or what's good for physics instruction or all of that, is you go talk to the people who are successful, right? And you sit down and you talk to the people who are successful and they say, okay, well, this worked and this worked and this worked, so you do that. And you don't talk to, if you talk about 100 people, maybe there are 4 of us that got through the process. You don't talk to the other 96. There's this great example that perhaps you've seen that refers to what's called survivorship bias, right? And it's this idea that, during World War II, the British Air Force, the British Army Air Force branch, would send out planes, and then the planes that would come back, they would look at where the bullet holes were, and the Army planners sat down and said, okay, well, that's where they're getting shot. We need to reinforce those things. And then a mathematician came along and said, no, that's not the problem. You're only looking at the planes that made it back. Getting shot where those planes got shot up didn't disable the aircraft. It's where they don't have holes. The guys who got shot in those places, they didn't get back. What you need to do is you need to reinforce the places where there aren't bullet holes, because when an aircraft gets shot in those places, it fails, and those aircraft don't make it back. Same thing, when you talk about, say, designing physics curriculum or designing physics programs or a number of things is, one of the things that I had to sort of recognize in my own bias of teaching physics is what worked for me didn't work for 95% of my classmates. I always tell the story to my students. When I started out in physics, there were 70 people in my class on the first day. When I finished physics, there were 7 of us. Nobody talked to the other 63 students who didn't make it through, right? What they do is they talk to us and they say, oh yeah, you guys, this worked for you. No, you got to talk to the people who it didn't work for if you want to make changes, right? That's a type of bias. You got to inherently understand your type of biases whenever you're trying to do good critical thinking. One of the things, and this is the in social media, this is the worst, right? If you've seen social media conversations, somebody has a feeling, they've decided that Democrats are bad, and then they see this thing that shows up in their social media feed about how this particular Democrat has done this horrible thing that's obviously unjust. Now, if that story's true, absolutely, that's a terrible thing. The problem is that what they don't do is they don't ever go check whether the source is in fact true, or if it's a parody source, or it's fake news, or anything like that. What they do is that the story confirms their bias that Democrats are bad, and so they put the full story forward. Now, I will say, this is kind of interesting on 2 levels. One, it's just bad critical thinking, as we'll talk about here. You got to check your sources, right? You got to be skeptical. But the second thing is once you do something like that, now you look just dumb. Right? You went out there, you didn't critically think, you just posted this thing about how, this Republican politician is this horrible human being. And then it turns out that story's fake, or that story's made up, or that story's distorted. And you just posted it not because you checked any of those things, but because it confirmed your bias. Now everyone looks at you and says, you're not a trustworthy actor in the public square. Your voice no longer has weight because nobody thinks that you actually have spent the time doing the critical thinking you need to do. Now you're just another partisan. You're just another rock thrower from the barricades. Instead, learn to critically think. And in this case, one of the big steps is to be aware of your own biases. And then, as you're looking at information, say, I like this. And you go, wait a minute. Do I like that because I think it's supported by evidence? Or do I like that because it confirms my biases? And if you sit there and say, okay, I may like this because it confirms my biases, you say, all right, well, what that means is I need to go and do double extra work, okay? Now, you also, of course, do that for other things too. If you're being a good critical thinker, you look in your various sources and you say, okay, what's their bias, right? If you're looking at a news outlet, and that news outlet has a political lean or a partisan bias, you take that into account as you evaluate the information they're giving you, right? Some news sources say, hey, we have a conservative editorial board and we are going to push conservative points of view. Other news sources say, hey, we have a more liberal or progressive or, communist or, libertarian or whatever you want to say. Find out what those things are and then filter the information you're getting through that, right? That's usually a really important thing. The other thing you try to do, and this is one of the hardest things, is you try, if you can, to remain emotionally detached, okay? That's a really important thing. And if you can't, and sometimes you just can't, sometimes, maybe you want to talk about, let's say, drunk driving policy. And let's say you have a relative that was killed by a drunk driver. There's no way you're going to remain emotionally detached in those discussions. What you have to do is you have to say, okay, if I'm going to have a voice in this discussion, I have to sort of acknowledge that I have an emotional attachment to the subject and then be aware of that. And sometimes what that means is you go, I can't be a part of this conversation. Someone else has to take that up. Maybe my role is to find a way to support that individual. Or maybe what you do is you say, I acknowledge my emotional attachment, and now what I'm going to do is try to analyze the data, understanding that I have that, but trying to compensate for that, okay? And that's, by the way, super hard to do. All right. Guideline number 4, and this is how you sort of, by the way, sort of deal with some of those things, is what I call there's an inherent skepticism and reliance on evidence in good critical thinking. So skepticism, as we talked about, is this attitude where knowledge is doubted. In other words, you don't, just because somebody says something, you don't just say, okay, well, this person says that because so it must be true. And by the way, that doesn't matter who it is. It might be the president, it might be a religious leader, it might be a famous scientist, it may be a celebrity or a sports figure or whatever. It doesn't matter. They can say whatever they want. You should doubt what they say. If they say this thing is true or we know this to be true, doubt that. Now, that doesn't mean, by the way, you're cynical. Cynicism is different from skepticism. It's not just that you doubt that piece of information. It's that you immediately assume that piece of information is wrong or self-serving or whatever the case. That's cynicism. Skepticism says, hey, I'm doubting this, and what I require evidence or sound reasoning to support conclusions. That's skepticism, okay? Good critical thinkers practice skepticism. They doubt information, they ask for evidence, but here's the thing. When the evidence is submitted, they accept the evidence and the conclusion that's based on it, even if they don't necessarily like the result, even if that's not something they're particularly happy with. So, maybe you're a person that supports, like I say, supports capital punishment. And the reason you support capital punishment is you believe that capital punishment will deter crime. And then evidence gets presented, and that evidence comes up and says, in places where you have capital punishment, there is no reduction in these certain types of crimes over places that don't have capital punishment. If you're a good skeptic, you say, okay, first off, I need to see your data for that evidence. You take a look at the data, and if the data supports, that evidence, and you sit down and say, okay, I may not like it, but now I have to sort of come up and say, this is what the evidence says, okay? An example that I've used in the past in my own way is back earlier in my career. One of the things that you do at college is you have what are called sometimes developmental studies or learning support courses. And this is for students coming out of high school that in some shape, or form or another, in some basic fundamental thing, haven't learned what they need in order to be successful at the college level. And so what you do is you try to remediate that. And so one of the things is that there was an idea from our learning support program at the college I was at, and this is when I was chair of our faculty senate, and we were looking at debating changes to our curriculum, and they came up with this idea that, hey, what we need to do is we need to have more support time. And so our students need to come in, and instead of taking a 3-credit-hour course before they start the college things, they need to take a 4-credit-hour course, or perhaps even 2 4-credit-hour courses. And it was one of those things you looked at and you said, that seems to make a lot of sense. And I had a colleague of mine who was so great at this, is he said, look, where's your data? And they didn't have a lot of data, but everybody kind of went along with it, and we approved the changes. And the great thing is our provost said, but because of this other faculty member, we're going to start making sure we collect the data. And within a year and a half, what we saw very clearly is by implementing those policies, which seemed to make so much sense, we actually saw that our success rate in our learning support courses and our learning support program declined. And all of a sudden, it became very, very clear that policy wasn't working. Now, the thing that was interesting is we had a certain number of faculty members who were like, no, that data can't be wrong. And one of the things I always tell my students is the data is never wrong, okay? Now, you may not know exactly how you collected it, but data is data, right? It's information that you gathered. And it turned out the data wasn't wrong. It was people's ideas about what should happen were wrong. And so what we did is we scaled that back. We made some major changes. The university system later on came along with additional data and made additional changes. And now you go to what's called sometimes a co-requisite model, where you take your learning support or your remediation alongside a college level class, and the data shows pretty clearly you get a greater percentage of students who are successful in that environment. In this case, it's really important you get that data. When the data comes in, you got to accept the conclusions based on that data. That's good skepticism right there. ask for the data, doubt the claims, but once the evidence comes in, you accept the conclusions based on that evidence, okay? And again, notice here, this applies especially to things that you disagree with, okay? In other words, if the evidence comes in, if you disagree with, the conclusion of the evidence, you sit there, you look at that, but then you go, okay, I got to accept that that's what's going on. And the thing is what you do is, as a good critical thinker, you've got to separate fact from opinion. Now, we have an episode, and again, if you're listening to this series straight through, what you have to understand is that the first 5 episodes of the series were recorded right at the beginning of the podcast. Episodes 6 and 7 have been recorded about 5 years later. In between, we've recorded a lot of episodes, and one of those episodes is titled Matters of Fact. We go in and we talk about what a fact is and where it comes from and how it develops and how it is not a thing that's been around forever and may not be around forever as a dominant way upon which one bases reasoning. But critical thinkers separate fact from opinion or conjecture. And then there's a strong reliance on evidence rather than, what you might call, well, but it's logical or common sense says, or, dogmatically people say, well, this is how it's always been. No, you say, wait, you ask for evidence. You ask for information and data that's been collected. And the other thing you do is you seek clarity and precision. One of the things that sometimes happens is when talking about these ideas, people are really muddy. Right? People aren't really good necessarily about defining their ideas, clarifying their ideas, understanding where evidence does and doesn't apply, right? Make sure you do that. And part of that, good critical thinkers are very clear in their use of language and use of terminology. Okay, they define their terms, they're good about that, and then they work from those definitions. And that's a really good thing. Carl Sagan has this kind of a great quote on skepticism, and he says, skeptical scrutiny is the means in which both science and religion, by which deep thoughts can be winnowed from deep nonsense. And that's really great. I think that's the thing that a lot of times happens is when you're looking at whatever it is you're looking at, there can be a lot of bizarre stuff. I saw this thing today about, COVID-19. Apparently there's this military historian that says, a whole bunch of us got COVID-19 back in the fall. Well, there's no evidence to support that. That's just an idea he's decided to have, right? And it's probably that probably falls in the area of deep nonsense. Now, it may be down the road that we get a little more information and find that whatever this this virus is, and however it jumped out of another species into humanity, maybe that happened a lot earlier than we thought. But all of the evidence that we have right now points to us kind of about a specific time frame, and it's later than he suggests it happens, right? And so this is a place where you do, we're Sagan, skeptical scrutiny, demanding evidence to support that point of view is so very important. And there are so many conspiracy theories about whether it's COVID-19 or a whole bunch of other stuff that just get blown up when you actually just say, okay, wait a minute. Let's really talk about what's going on with this. Let's provide your evidence. Let's take a look at the evidence. Okay, and that's the thing you want to get good at. All right. Now, what happens when you don't necessarily have You don't know everything. You don't have all the facts or every possible fact, or maybe not every possible fact is even known yet. So let's talk about that. And that is guideline number 5 in proper use of inference. The idea of inference is that what you're doing is you've got some information and then you're drawing or inferring other things from that information that may not entirely be directly supported. Okay. So you can use logical inference. Okay. So in this, I would say that there's sort of, when you do this and you use logical inference processes, there are a couple of things that you've got to try to do. The first, there's a recognition that you can't know everything, okay? And so you've got to allow some level of inference. Okay, that's fine, right? It's not unskeptical. It's just, okay, that's just part of the process of living in a real world where there's real uncertainty, okay? Now, If you're going to allow inference, though, they've got to follow proper rules of logic. In other words, if the inference is inductive, you got to say, okay, does this follow a proper inductive reasoning argument, or abductive or deductive, or whatever the case may be? Identify what kind of thing it is. Is this a deductive argument? Is it an inductive argument? Do the premises support the conclusions? Do we have logical fallacies built in? All of those sorts of things. Go and check that stuff. Now, secondly, one of the things that's really important is to understand that an inference is not a fact. Okay, inferences are not facts, which means an inference, you have to be open to modification of that inference based on new information. Okay, new information is always arising. Okay, again, remember, you're trying to be open-minded and adaptable to new information. So if you make an inference, what you've got to do sort of in your head is you've got to say, this is not a fact, which means if new data comes in, I may have to change this inference or get rid of it altogether. Okay? And a kind of a thing, you hear this a lot, but a great example of the type of inference mistakes you can make here is what I sometimes call the confusion of correlation and causation, right? Just because two things, right? You may have, your facts may be that, variable X is increasing and variable Y is increasing. And what that means is those things have a correlation. Mathematically, that's what you call it. You can sit down and say they're correlated by this sort of thing, usually by creating a graph. What you can't do, though, is you can't necessarily say that X and Y, like X causes Y, or Y causes X. That's an inference right there, okay? The big mistake a lot of people do is they confuse correlation with causation, right? If you're going to say that X causes Y, what you're doing is you're saying I have the fact that X is increasing. I have the fact that Y is increasing. I have the fact that those increases seem to be correlated given the data that I have. That's fine. The inference is therefore that X causes Y. And the thing that you have to be careful about is you have to recognize that, hey, wait a minute, that's an inference. It could be that there's a third hidden variable, Z, and Z is also increasing, and what you know, Z is causing both X and Y. But if you make the mistake of X causes Y, you're never going to go look for Z, right? So by understanding that, X causes Y is an inference, if you decide to make that, that's an important thing. Right? To understand that's an inference and to be open to making changes to that inference as you're going along. So that's good critical thinking. Finally, guideline number 6 is the last one we'll talk about before we wrap up. That is, good critical thinkers examine as much available evidence as possible. The idea of using multiple sources. Okay? And that's, like in the case for, I talked about my example of teaching pedagogy and what's going on with that. I want to see multiple papers. I want to read a lot of papers. I want to find the guys out there who are saying, hey, we're not sure we agree with this. And then evaluating that evidence, okay? And the thing that's really interesting here is what you're going to do is you're going to draw conclusions based on information, not from a single source, but from multiple sources, okay? Because as we talked about, if we're talking about, say, your critical thinking about policy decisions or something like that. Say it's something not as cut and dried as a scientific experiment in the discipline of physics, et cetera, et cetera. Let's say it's something a little more complex, lots more hidden or unknown variables, that kind of thing. If that's what you've got going on, you want multiple sources because you know that every one of your sources is probably going to have some sort of a bias. Sometimes that bias will be obvious, sometimes it'll be less so. By having multiple sources, what you can do is begin to sort of cross-triangulate or cross-check to see maybe and compensate for those biases, right? So that's really important, okay? In doing that, what you want to do is when you're drawing from multiple sources, I always say you're looking to identify convergent evidence. In other words, if all four of your sources are saying, here's a piece of information, and they all agree that that piece of information is that piece of information, and they have different perspectives, different biases, different paradigms they're coming from, then probably that's a pretty well established piece of information. You can probably say, okay, maybe, by the way, good sources are going to say, hey, and here's where that piece of information comes from. Here's the scientific paper that was published in. Here's the statistics released from the Department of Labor, whatever the case may be. Okay. Now, the other thing that you do is you always evaluate that source based on the previous track record. And this is something that I got to say, the example that I always sort of use when I get into conversations with people about this, and especially with climate change, right? One of the things that having been around these conversations back since the early 80s, is all of the voices saying that climate change isn't happening or it's not a big deal or whatever are the same voices that said we don't have an ozone problem. We don't have a problem where these chemicals that we produce as refrigerants, things like Freon, when they are released into the atmosphere, move their way up into the stratosphere and then begin breaking down ozone molecules in the stratosphere, thereby thinning the shield sort of that protects us against ultraviolet light coming from the sun. During the 1980s, when there was this long conversation about banning these types of refrigerants, there was this whole group of people that said this isn't a problem and this isn't happening and this isn't a big deal and we don't have to worry about this, even as the scientific evidence was piling up and piling up and piling up. And so when finally the ban has happened, they grumped and groaned and they said things like it's going to ruin economies and all of that, which interestingly enough now 30 years later, it doesn't seem like anyone's talking about the fact that, Maytag or, Samsung, when making a refrigerator, can't use Freon as the coolant in their system there. Nobody's talking about that having ruined the economy, which is interesting. All of those same guys are now saying that we don't have to worry about climate change and we don't have to think about renewable energy resources and all of this other thing. For me, as a critical thinker, they were wrong and really wrong in that first conversation. That means that I actually, honestly, unless they provide good evidence to the contrary, just, their argument from authority that they might make is completely discounted. They may come in and say, well, I'm a Nobel Prize winning economist or I'm this or that. I don't care. You were really wrong before. And unless you can come up with really good evidence that, addresses the issues that, the consensus of the climatological community, the people who do the research on this, unless you can come up with evidence to the contrary, I really don't care what you have to say, okay? Because you have a track record of just being wrong, okay? And that's just one of those things when you're considering sources. You just sit down and you look at their track record. And if their track record is being wrong a lot, well, maybe you don't listen to what they have to say as much. Okay? You listen to the people that tend to get it right. Okay? And that may be, that can be from all different sides. Okay? And so that's something that's super important. Consider your previous track record of your sources. All right, so what I want to do is I kind of want to wrap this episode up. Those are the sort of the 6 things. And so I want to sort of use an interesting example. And this goes back to our foxes and hedgehogs. The Isaiah Berlin essay had a pretty profound impact on how people began to sort of think about the ideas of sort of how we look at processing ideas and processing information. I think one of the things that's really interesting is I think, there are, roughly similar times, not the same time, but roughly similar times. You got Thomas Kuhn coming out with the structure of scientific revolutions. And there's some interesting things going on there. Later on, Joseph Ellis will, in his book Founding Fathers, will talk about how George Washington was a hedgehog, had one idea about how during his presidency, about how, the United States would expand as a country. You have all kinds of different people. James Collins' book, Good to Great. A lot of these folks talk about hedgehog mentalities. What I'm going to suggest, though, is I'm going to suggest that for the critical thinker, maybe the hedgehog mentality isn't the best. And probably the strongest piece of evidence I'm going to put forward, and if you're a person who studied critical thinking and you listen to podcasts like Freakonomics or the 538 podcast or something like that, you may be familiar with probably Philip Tetlock's sort of seminal paper. So Tetlock is a political psychology professor, and he was at the University of Pennsylvania. And what he began to do is he began to look at these political prognosticators, and he got to asking himself a question: how right are these guys? And are there anything that sort of influences how right they are or how wrong they are? Now, one of the things that I always sort of talk about is when I was a kid growing up in the 80s, these sorts of what I call political opinion shows were pretty common, right? Usually on Sunday morning in particular, they get this sort of round table, right? And they try to have this variety of opinions, variety of different political viewpoints sitting at the table. You might have your conservative, you might have your liberal, you might have a Democrat, you might have a Republican, yeah, who knows? But they would try to have this sort of thing where they would have this sort of roundtable. Probably the biggest one that you may have heard of, because it lasted the longest before being absolutely annihilated by Jon Stewart, okay, was the thing called Crossfire, right? And you were supposed to have this sort of conservative and this liberal, and they were supposed to have an argument, right? And what Stewart, of course, sort of does is he makes it very, very clear that it was all just a bunch of political theater to enhance ratings, right? But what Tetlock did is Tetlock said, look, I'm going to sit down, I'm actually going to look at these guys, and I'm going to look at what they write, I'm going to look at their ideas, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something no one does, because these guys basically, they spend week in and week out making predictions about the economy, predictions about elections, predictions about, world events, whatever. And and so the thing is what Tetlock did is he began to look at that information, and he uses Berlin's dichotomy in a sense. He says, look, we're going to sort of bunch these guys into two categories just for simplicity, understanding there's nuance in there. But we're going to look and see if their people are foxes, which means they have a bunch of little ideas, and they use all these little ideas to sort of shape their political prognostication. Or, on the other side, are these individuals who have really strongly held sort of singular beliefs, things like the free market always works better, big government is always bad, socialism is a better form of government than democracy or than capitalism, whatever the case may be. And what he began to do is he sort of looked at these, and his sort of in the paper, which is called Expert Political Judgment, it was published in 2005. Okay. What he said is and I think it's the full title of the paper is Expert Political Judgment, How Good Is It and How Can We Know? What he says, he sort of says they're hedgehogs, they're type A personalities who believe in big ideas and governing principles, ideologies, those kinds of things that underlie and govern everything that's going on. And then he said there are some of the political prognosticators were foxes. And the way I wrote this in my notes is they're scrappy little creatures who believe in a plethora of little ideas. They take multiple approaches towards a problem, and they're more tolerant of nuance, uncertainty, complexity, and dissenting opinion, which, by the way, if you've been listening to the podcast, you kind of already know where I'm going with this. And so what Tetlock did is he just looked at how well they did. He said, how well did they do in terms of predictions? And what Tetlock found was that in the fields related to behavioral sciences and making predictions, so that would be things like economics, politics, sociology, those kinds of things. He found that the foxes were considerably better at forecasting or predicting future events than the hedgehogs were. And not just a little bit, considerably. If you've listened to the Freakonomics episodes with Tetlock, what you find out is Tetlock later on put on sort of a project, and he developed teams, and the teams sort of got points for predicting things. And again, what Tetlock found was absolutely this result was completely confirmed. Okay, and so if you're familiar with the 538 website and the podcast that goes with that, the guy who runs that is a guy by the name of Nate Silver. And Nate Silver, of course, selected as sort of the icon for the 538 brand as a fox. And so you get a sense that Silver, who, by the way, makes his living doing things like political predictions, specifically, what are the election outcomes going to be and that sort of thing. But Silver published a book called The Signal and the Noise, and I cannot recommend this book highly enough from my perspective, because I think it's a phenomenal discussion of how one makes predictions, both in scientific realms, how do you predict things like the weather, earthquakes, stuff like that, but also in other realms. He talks about having to, how if you're gambling, right, you're in a card game and you got to predict what the other guy's doing and how well you do that, those kinds of things. What he sort of talks about is he talks about some of the characteristics of foxes versus hedgehogs. And these sort of line up with some of what we're talking about in our discussion of characteristics of good critical thinking. And so, we'll sort of contrast these. We'll do foxes and then the contrasting attitude or behavior of the hedgehog, according to Silver. And what Silver says is foxes, they're multidisciplinary. They incorporate ideas from different disciplines, whereas hedgehogs tend to be very specialized. Most of their thinking or work has just been on one or two areas or one or two ideas or problems. He says foxes display adaptability. They're willing to find new approaches. They're willing to use multiple approaches. Whereas hedgehogs, he says, are stalwart. They stick to the same sort of all-in approach. New data only refines an old model, doesn't make you create a new one. Foxes tend to be self-critical. And they tend to show the tendency, and by the way, this is one of the things human beings are really hard at, but foxes tend to show the ability or the willingness to acknowledge mistakes when they make predictions. If their prediction is wrong, they say, I got this wrong, and I've obviously got a problem in my model, or I've got a problem in my priors or something. They tend to be more willing to do that, whereas hedgehogs are oftentimes more stubborn. Generally, what you'll see in that case, and I would see this every week, week in, week out on those political shows where the prognosticator would say, oh, I just, bad luck, or I didn't have all the data, or this, I understand this was different because of this one unusual circumstance that's not going to be the case anywhere else. So my underlying model is still valid, and you'll hear that a lot nowadays. Foxes tend to be tolerant of complexity. They see the universe as complex. And so they may say sometimes, I can't make a prediction on this. We just don't know. We just don't have the information we need. Whereas hedgehogs tend to be order seeking. Okay, in other words, the idea is they tend to, and this is something I think that comes out of the Enlightenment, you tend to sort of see the universe, whether this is true or not, in terms of natural laws. And there are just a few of them, and they tend to be pretty simple, and you can apply that natural law across a broad set of things. And so, this was, after, one of the things I always talk about is after Newton's publication of the Principia in 1687, right? And the fact that, once everyone realized, and this took a while, once everyone realized just how profoundly sort of broad it was and the implications that were, you began very quickly to see the idea that, okay, we can create natural laws in a whole bunch of other fields, right? Voltaire is explicit about wanting to do this because he so admires Newton's great work of synthesis in the Principia, is that, Thomas Locke is doing the same thing. I'm going to develop an empirical approach to political science, and we're going to base everything on empirical data, and we're going to come up with natural laws that always work for political systems. You tend to see that still in hedgehogs today, is what Silver argues. Silver says that foxes tend to be cautious. They express predictions in probabilities rather than in certainties, whereas hedgehogs tend to be confident. They don't hedge their predictions, and they're reluctant to make changes on them even when evidence to the contrary comes up. Finally, foxes tend to be empirical. They tend to rely on observations and data rather than theory, whereas hedgehogs tend to be ideological. They expect solutions to problems are manifestations of those natural laws, right? That's what they tend to see. They have these ideologies, and then everything flows from those ideologies. And the thing is what we know from Tetlock's work is that the foxes are better at making predictions of the future than the hedgehogs are. And that evidence, that data is really pretty darn clear. And so as an example of this is an example to me of critical thinking. The guidelines that we're talking about here in terms of critical thinking turn out to work really well. And if I were to make sort of one statement, it goes back to some things that I talked about here earlier. I think, one of the things you can say about critical thinkers is the foxes tend to be what I would say more inductive in their reasoning. What they recognize is that they're using inductive reasoning as their basis for what they're doing. And so in that inductive reasoning, they recognize that inductive reasoning doesn't always produce true results, even if the conclusions are rationally based on the premises of an argument. Whereas hedgehogs view themselves as doing deductive reasoning. Okay, and this goes back very much to sort of what I would say is a medieval worldview, where evidence was not held to be nearly as high a factor or nearly as important a foundation for arriving at truth as things like deductive reasoning and logic, things that sort of came out of how do we understand God during medieval times. And so what you see even until today is these hedgehogs tend to use deductive reasoning. And they say, here's my premise and here's my other premise, and I arrive at a conclusion based on deductive reasoning, and so that conclusion has to be true. Not understanding that, they may have a case where, their premises are inductive style premises, not deductive style premises. So as we wrap up here, I hope you'll give this some thought as you're working through in your process of critical thinking, that you'll think about these guidelines and then do whatever you can to put into practice. After the break here, we'll come back and I'll have a few closing comments. As we wrap up this episode, I just want to say a couple of things. First off, I want to give a huge shout out and a thanks to the folks at the Blue Dot Sessions. They're a musical collective out of the Pacific Northwest that makes the music that we feature in our podcast. They've been kind enough to allow us to use their compositions as sort of the soundtrack for our podcast as we move through this. And I want to say thanks to them. And sort of echo a comment that Mike Duncan has made in his Revolutions podcast, which I think is absolutely true. I'm really, really fortunate, at least for the time being. I don't know what the future holds, but right now I'm still teaching classes, and I'll talk about that here more in a minute. And I have a steady paycheck, and economically, I'm in a reasonably secure position. All of those musicians, all of those performers, all of other podcasters, all of the people who do a lot of the creative work that makes our society so much more enjoyable to live in right now because of the absolutely necessary social distancing measures that have been put in place to help control the spread of this virus. A lot of those folks have lost their livelihoods or have found their income streams significantly curtailed. I have a cycling friend of mine back in Georgia who's a jazz musician, and he posted this morning on Facebook, it's been a month since he's had a gig. And he used to play all the time, and now all of that has dried up. So the thing I might suggest is, if you're a person who's like me, who maybe you've managed to be in a field that's either essential, let's say you're in education or whatever, and you've got a little extra disposable income, now's the time to reach out and help those around you who are probably just really struggling. Okay. If you have artist friends or whatever, as Mike says, they've all got Venmos or Patreon accounts or PayPal or something, some way to support them. If you can, throw a few extra bucks their way. Maybe if you feel like there's got to be some sort of trade, organize a concert over a video sharing thing that you and some of your friends are all going to listen to them play or perform or do whatever it is through Zoom or FaceTime or Skype or, whatever it happens to be. And, say, hey, we'll pay you $100 if you'll provide 45 minutes of music on a Sunday afternoon or something like that. Help your neighbors out. Give them a hand. If you've got a podcaster you're listening to and you've sort of been wondering, well, do I want to support them on Patreon? Now's the time to kick a few bucks their way. That may be something that they will use to supplement income in this gig economy thing that we've got going on. This is a time to reach out. And if you're wondering about, can I support them? Now's the time, if you've got that disposable income a little bit, to do that. Okay. Maybe if you're not eating out as much, because, you can't go to your favorite restaurant, take that money, that $50 that maybe you would have spent going to that favorite restaurant once a month, and give that to a couple of folks in those situations. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I want to say is to all of the emergency services and healthcare workers who are on the front line of this pandemic. Thank you. Thank you so much for everything you do. And thank you to your families. If you're a family member of someone who's got to go to a hospital and every day be exposed to this, and, they're having to quarantine in a garage or in a RV trailer or whatever, thank you all so much for your sacrifices. I can't even begin to say, just how grateful I am. And I know how grateful so many people are that you're out there and you're taking these great risks and assuming these great personal sacrifices for what it is that is basically healing people and keeping people alive through what is a really, really difficult time. I know that thanks are, when you're sitting in that RV and you can't go and spend time with your kids and you're having to FaceTime from your driveway in to say hi, tuck your kids in at night and read them that bedtime story, that my thanks is probably pretty paltry, but I want to offer it. I want to give it to you. And for all of us who are not in that, let's do our part by continuing to follow these social distancing guidelines. Stay at home, listen to podcasts, podcast listenership's way down. Whatever you need to do, let's not put additional burden on those folks, and let's not put them at additional risk. They're already doing so much for us. Let's do our part to support them as that time goes on. A third thing I want to say is to all of my fellow educators out there. Boy, this is interesting. I got to tell y'all, I had planned to get this out a week after the first episode, and this is literally the first moment I've had to actually sit down and take, a little more than an hour to record something and do the processing. The amount of time that I'm spending trying to get 3 physics classes from face-to-face to some kind of online thing while preserving some level of standards so that the students who pass my classes have a fighting chance in their next level classes that build on the material I'm supposed to get them. It's a lot of work. I'll be honest with you. I'm in my home office here every day. And that's not, by the way, I'm not sort of trying to get some sort of pity or anything like that. I mean, my sacrifices are pretty paltry compared to some of the things that I've just mentioned. But understand that for those, if you know some educators out there, know that they're working their butts off. I've seen some things online that are some people getting pretty frustrated with educators because they keep sending homework home to their kids and they don't have time to do this or do that. Understand, like for me, I got an email from my provost basically telling me, look, you still have to show that your students meet the learning outcomes for your class. I mean, it's we haven't canceled classes, and I can't just give A's or B's to all of my students just because, this is terrible. Is this what I wanted to do as an educator? This is not what I wanted to do. I don't think this is the best solution, but this is what our society has decided is we're going to continue to try to educate students through this pandemic using the technology that we've got. And I'm fortunate that I teach college, but I'll tell you, it's tough. For those of you who are students who are listening to this, my heart goes out to you guys. I know this is hard. You're trying to do 8,000 things, and there's economic insecurity, and you don't know what's going to happen. There's a ton of stress, and there's still classwork. Trust me, I get it, and I know a lot of my colleagues get it. This is a hard time. The best thing we can do, communicate with each other, reach out for help. Mike Duncan says this in his latest episode. He canceled shame. Mike Duncan has canceled shame because and the reason he does that is because everybody's ashamed to ask for help. Especially here in the United States, we have this mentality of this sort of Western ruggedness and individualism and standing on your own 2 feet and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And that creates this sense of shame when we can't do that. Well, Mike has canceled shame officially. So, shame is out. So ask for help. Ask your neighbors for help. Ask your teachers for help. Ask your classmates for help. These aren't normal times. The social conventions are all sort of canceled in this respect. Let's help each other out. Let's do the best we can. And finally, for goodness sakes, don't spread misinformation about all of this COVID stuff. Okay, there's so much of it out there, and so much of it is just demonstrably false, and it doesn't take a whole lot. Practice the critical thinking skills that we've talked about in here. Help your neighbors, help your family members learn how to think through just the mountains of terrible information. One of the things that's really interesting to me is just, I think, all of the bad information that's coming out about the possibility of cures or treatments or whatever. And, one of the things that I read here recently is somebody posting a kind of a thing where they said, well, we don't have time for scientists to take 3 to 5 years to do clinical studies and all of that sort of thing. Understand that folks in the medical professions don't want to take 3 to 5 years either, right? Normally those clinical trials take that long because it takes that long to get good data, to get enough data to actually draw conclusions. They're practicing good critical thinking by not saying, hey, we're going to do a study with 8 people and then base an entire treatment regimen on there. They're working hard. They're, I guess the one silver lining is now that we have so many people who are infected with this, you can do clinical trials with very large numbers of people much more rapidly. But no scientist, no doctor, no scientist, no anybody wants to have that article come out that says, and this article is going to come out in the major news media where they want to sell papers, is they're going to say, scientists rush to judgment on treatment and may have put tens of thousands of lives at risk. No scientist wants to be a part of that headline, right? And it's not just for professional reputation perspectives. Obviously, that's terrible for your professional reputation if it turns out that, you decided on very limited evidence to recommend a treatment, and it turns out that treatment not only was ineffective, but may have put people's lives at risk. I mean, that's devastating to your professional reputation. But beyond that, I think most folks, it's not even that. It's that they just don't want to put tens of thousands of people's lives at risk because they didn't do their job. They didn't do their critical thinking. They didn't make sure that they weren't going to harm people. And so, this idea, you see all of these sorts of cures already, I think, I've already seen that massive doses of vitamin C. Oh, no, it's massive doses of vitamin D3. It's all of this information. Again, practice your critical thinking skills. Trust your experts. Be a part of that conversation, gather evidence, gather data, see what's going on, be in consultation with healthcare providers if you're infected with this. But understand, these folks are working as hard as they can. And by just, piling on and putting out misinformation, you're not helping things at all. Okay? The best thing that you can do is support those folks. If you've got scientists, or you've got researchers, and again, for goodness sakes, if you have healthcare folks that do whatever you can to support them. Send them a hot meal. That's 10 times better than posting some dumb article to Facebook or, raging on something on Twitter. Is to take that, that basket of fried chicken or that casserole or whatever it is to the family who one of the parents in the family is a nurse, and it's things are tough. That does so much more good than any of the kind of, oh my gosh, I'm gonna spread something that I read on some social media site, So anyway, enough of my sort of pontificating here. I hope you all hang in there. You're all staying healthy. Keep practicing good critical thinking. It makes the world a better place. It makes your life a better place. On our next episode, which will be the final episode in this 3-part series, we're going to talk about barriers to good critical thinking. We talked about characteristics of good critical thinking today. So let's talk about what happens on the other side. What gets in the way of doing good critical thinking, and how can we address that? So until next time, full sails on your journey.